to
I think we'll wait a couple of minutes for some of our other reviewers. I know that there should be probably at least two people. Well, at least I need even
I'm
later.
not hearing more day one.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. But it seems that Jonathan Haynes cannot hear me, so maybe something is off. Noah, can you hear me? Good.
Yes, you can hear us. So we can
So I don't know whether Anuli is going to be joining us in person. I don't know about Onokome as well. Okay, maybe I'll just wait I don't know, how many minutes more should we wait? Maybe like 3 minutes more, and at least start with those who are here and hope that the others will.
Andre's not joining us today. Andre's not joining us. Okay.
Are you on fire?
Yes, I'm on fire.
I think it's you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so we do have some people in the room. So I think it's Alexander Budd is in the room. Good. Hi, how are you?
Hi, fine, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I can see there's this thing of looking at the screen and looking at the camera. Yeah. So I don't know if whoever is our host knows whether Anjali is going to be in person or not.
I don't think Annalee is going to be present at all today.
Okay.
Or she said she might come as an audience member, but she's not going to be speaking.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for relaying that piece of information. So that helps us. In that case, I think, well, Ono isn't here, so I don't know what's happening, but he's supposed to be the last speaker. So I think go ahead and get started with this author meets reviewers, or reviewers meet author panel. Thank you to everyone who's joining us on Zoom, and thank you to all of those who are in the room in Lagos. I'm very excited to be present for this panel where we have several distinguished scholars who will be offering their thoughts on the book on the recent book by our colleague titled Cinematic Independence, Constructing the Big Screen in Nigeria. I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say since I've been doing a lot of work on the small screen more recently. So we'd like to, I'd like to know how our colleagues respond to Professor Noah Tsika's work on constructing the big screen in Nigeria. Tsika, for those who work on screen media in Nigeria, needs no introduction whatsoever. We are familiar with some of his earlier work on screen media developments in Nigeria. And we're fortunate to have several speakers here today who will be sharing their thoughts on the book, who are all in various ways experts on the subject. They're all experts on the subject. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. We are going, we've been told that everyone should speak for 12 minutes. Maybe if we made it 10, if you can somehow make it into 10, but if not, because we also have to fit in time for Noah to respond to the questions and comments that have, that the reviewers will be making. And then maybe we might have a handful of questions from the people in the room and maybe even on Zoom as well. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to go to our very first speaker, and that is Dr. Chijioke Sife. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's fine.
From the Catholic, thank you, from the Catholic Institute of West Africa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Let me begin immediately by congratulating Noah Tsika for doing a brilliant job of charting a rich and most engaging historiography of film production and exhibition in colonial and post-colonial Nigeria in his book, Cinematic Independence, Constructing the Big Screen in Nigeria. Tsika's beautiful writing complements the book's depth of research and incisive analysis, all of which combined to bring the historical content of his study to life. I find Cinematic Independence fascinating in the way that it maps out the history of the big screen cinema in Nigeria, anchoring this enterprise on what the author calls, quotes, two modalities of political independence, end of quote, in Nigeria, namely the two periods of the colonization from 1960 and its return to democratic rule in 1999. By tracing the emergence, demise, and rebirth of big screen exhibition in Nigeria, the book revisits and analyzes not only the history of cinema in Nigeria, but also the tenacity of the cinema medium in the unstable waters of Nigeria's post-colonial political economy. But then the book goes beyond illustrating this dynamic history of theatrical film in Nigeria to demonstrate the profound relevance of that history to the general conceptions of film theory, film aesthetics, and film history in global cinema. In that sense, the book makes the claim that, given, for instance, the significant position that Lagos continues to occupy in the political economy of global Hollywood from the 1960s, the Nigerian cinema, and by extension, the African cinema, has never really been that peripheral in the development of the film medium. One of the key things that cinematic independence does for me is that by connecting a thread between the return of the multiplex in Nigeria in the mid-2000s and the vibrant and dynamic big screen culture of post-independence Nigeria, the book furthers the location of Nollywood and the discourse around it within an abiding Nigerian filmmaking experience that preceded it, and together with its interactions with the global Hollywood. In contrast, for instance, to Haijinu Sekwazi's 1987 claim that there has never been any foreign-owned production company in Nigeria, Tsika demonstrates the presence of Hollywood production companies in Nigeria from the late 1950s. One can see how the author here in the book project is rooted in the exchanges at the intersection of Nollywood and Hollywood, as the author makes concrete and understudied of political, economic, and cultural connections between Nigeria and the United States. Nollywood grew out of the mass theater closures of the early 1990s Nigeria, coming from this. Over the years, however, it has grown from its traditional direct-to-video production to a big screen powerhouse for particular patrons and clientele. Tsika does a remarkable job at highlighting and interrogating how the circumstances that informed this Nollywood trajectory came about. He calls the Nollywood success, quote, a specific Nigerian achievement, end of quote, thereby foregrounding the contributions of both the government and individual Nigerian executives to this success. However, the author also acknowledges the secondary role of Hollywood and to a lesser extent, Chinese capital in realizing the Nigerian big screen renaissance. At the same time, he implicates Hollywood companies in the disruptions of filmmaking in the newly independent Nigeria. A residue of that disruption remains manifest in the vertical integration of the big screen cinema in Nigeria today. This consolidation of film production, distribution, exhibition has continued to impact access to the big screen, as independently produced Nigerian films find it difficult to obtain screen space. Nollywood owes this tradition to Hollywood companies, a tradition that goes back to the era, sometimes through the Lebanese middlemen who represented their distribution and exhibition interests. However, more than these disruptions, the author also points out that by investing in and spearheading the building of multiplexes in Nigeria, Hollywood contributes to shaping the built environment of Lagos and other Nigerian cities, and in other ways. The author has done a tremendous job, and I really do not have much to say by way of critique. However, while acknowledging the challenge of accessing archival materials in Nigeria, which the author mentions, I would say that a book of this nature could have benefited more from such materials. And I would be interested to know if the author made any attempts at accessing the National Film Institute's archives in Jos, for instance. Secondly, the author uses the proposed IMAX theater at Eko, Atlantic City, to argue that such a presence demonstrates, quote, the clustering of elite multinational interests around the promise of big screen spectacle, quote. That argument, however, appears tenuous, given the multiple other major factors that drive the Eko Atlantic project. To conclude, in my categorization of Nollywood studies and the scholars that produce its corpus, I usually grouped Tsika and his contemporaries among the second generation. With cinematic independence, he has further enriched the rapidly expanding literature of that field, inspiring the next generation and those that will come later with his brilliant scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azwa Wisife, for that comprehensive review of Noah Tsika's book, and for completing your presentation under time. So you are giving us plenty of additional time, even though we started late. So thank you very, very much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Alexander Budd from the Africa Initiative. Over to you, and you are there live in Lagos.
I am, yes, thank you. Before I begin, I wonder if we can modify the camera setup a bit, because at the moment I can't actually look at the camera and Noah at the same time. Is there any way we could move it so that, yeah.
Okay.
This way is okay. You're looking at us.
Yeah, but I can't actually see.
No, in order to
you.
look at the camera when he's speaking, we have to look away from the
Yeah,
screen. So I understand what he's saying.
It would be helpful if I could actually look at them whilst I'm speaking to them.
Okay.
If you could move that camera here, or move me here. Can we move me? That camera needs to be pointing in this direction. No, the other way. This way.
Or you can show the camera in this way, no table.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yes,
Right,
yeah.
Is it clear? Yeah, thank you. So we need this back.
All the way back.
Yes.
Yep.
We're doing some cinematic maneuvering today.
Okay.
Okay,
You can just speak looking at the camera. Finishes, you can look at us on the screen.
Right, can you move the camera?
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
Well, right now you can see the air conditioning, so that's great, you know.
It's Lagos.
Then
It
don't move
is
this.
indeed. You've got to make adjustments. Okay, are you ready to start? Currently we cannot hear Dr. Bud. We cannot hear him. So could you move the microphone close to where he is? We still cannot hear you, unfortunately. It may be that we have to go back to the former position so that we can hear you, because it would help for Noah in particular to hear what you were saying. I'm sure he'll be happy to read the review later on, but for today.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'd like to start off by commending Dr. Tsika on this book. It's a piece of thorough, meticulous research, and in particular, I'd like to commend him on his originality, which I think is a real hallmark of his work, going back to his previous book on Nollywood Stars and this book as well. That is very much a first. The specific points that I appreciated in the book, I really liked how he has brought out the relationship between Nollywood and the Lebanese in quite a specific way. You've really brought out the way that these business networks operated for the first time, I believe. The chapter on the Enugu film project was very eye-opening, especially in terms of it being a precursor to later film villages. The London UK connection is very important. It's an area I'm familiar with and will say a bit more about. And lastly, the conclusion on vertical integration and concentration in Nollywood, I thought was a very germane way to end the book. I'll bring out a few points for discussion. I think the issue of defining epochs is always tricky, and I'll suggest some alternative epochs, specifically the 1999 one. I've done research on development of red carpet culture in Nigeria, prestigious entertainment events, corporately sponsored ones. And I mean, I've seen that there was quite a flowering of these from the late 1980s till the early 1990s. So I'm thinking about events like the Nigerian Music Awards, the Lekki Sunsplash events, Carney Riv in Port Harcourt, and some of the Silverbird beauty pageants, which you did mention. So the point there is that was 1999 really the beginning, such a clear beginning of a new epoch, or was it more a case of there being a sort of loosening and flowering from the late 80s, and then there being a 5-year sort of pause between 93 and 98? Although even then, we have the first ever Nollywood award ceremony happening right in the middle of that period, which was a glamorous red carpet event, and I think very much in line with cinema culture that you discuss. I think that I'll say a few points about your sort of theoretical approach, this critical political economy approach, cultural studies. I'd be interested to hear your reflections on the benefits and limitations of taking this approach. I think you say somewhere that your focus is very much on the big structures, like for me, there are things that do get lost to an extent in such an approach. Things like skilled practice, strategies on a more micro level, and culture, not in the cultural study sense, more in the cultural anthropological sense of culture. And I guess connected with that, the way that US economic imperialism gets conflated with British political imperialism and Christianity to an extent. Connected with some of those themes, I do like what you do about the London cinema culture. I think it is very apposite. I think you could bring out the cultural aspects more in the sense that it's presented in the book as a very corporate initiative. Whilst I think if you go back to the early 2000s, Moses Babitopia at that point was really an evangelist for African cinema. He was not the managing director of Film One at that stage. He was someone who was really campaigning for the Odeon to take a chance on Nigerian cinema, and it was something that was not some kind of corporately motivated neoliberal strategy. It was a passion project for him at that time. And there were a lot of quite sort of localized networks between him, Obiam and Alonia, and that whole community in London. And also a lot of screenings at the level below the Odeon and the Empire, which were grassroots. They still carry on to this day, and they're still an important part of that ecosystem. And some of that culture existed well before before 2004. So you have things like the Afro Hollywood Awards starting in 1996, where they'd fly over Nollywood stars to London and have that red carpet experience. So you have that promotional red carpet culture taking place in London from the mid 1990s. I think lastly, or maybe almost lastly, I'll say a few words about the Enugu film project and the Tinapa. I found it fascinating. It's a story that I didn't know about, and I think probably most Nollywood scholars did not know about the interventions in Enugu well before Nollywood. I'd be interested to know whether you found a specific connection between Tinapa and that project, or whether it's more just a genealogy. And also to ask you about the more general trend of promoting film villages. And this has been a trend across, I think, at least half a dozen state governments in Nigeria over the last 10 to 15 years. Most of them abortive or in a state of being half built. Would you include those projects in that same category? And I think most relevant for today is the one being built by Kunle Afolayan and Theo Lawson, I believe in Oyo State, which is actually almost complete as far as I understand. Whether you would locate that project within this history as well. Okay, really lastly, I do really appreciate what you said about the Lebanese businessmen and their role in the history of cinema. I wonder if you could say some more on that. I would have liked to have seen a bit more on their own perspectives, and how they operated, not just as a kind of function of Hollywood capital, but as a discrete entity. But overall, I congratulate you on this book. I learned an enormous amount from it. It's a highly original contribution, and I'm sure we all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Budd. You two did not use up your fully allotted time. And thank you for the many pointed questions, which Noah and the rest of us will have to reflect on. So I think the way we're doing for time, we're going to actually have lots of time for conversation, discussion back and forth. So I hope folks in the audience will be preparing their questions. I believe we'll have enough time for that, and we might receive a number of questions online as well. Our last reviewer, before we hand the microphone, the metaphorical Zoom microphone to the author, is going to be Professor Jonathan Haynes of Long Island University, who needs no introduction to anyone who works in and on Nollywood. One of the pioneers of the field. So over to you, John.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here. I wish I were actually in Lagos, but here we are in the way we can be together. In 2015, at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference in Montreal, Noah organized and chaired a workshop called From Satellite to Center, Redressing the Marginalization of African Screen Media. And that workshop then formed the basis for a special section of the journal Black Camera, which Noah edited, which I think came out in 2016. The Society for Cinema and Media Studies illustrated the point about our marginalization by not showing up at the workshop. For a while, there were more of us on the panel than there were in the audience. Anyway, Maura Dawan was part of it, and as usual, had some very insightful things to say. One of them that really stuck with me was her point that kind of on the sociology of the people who published about Nollywood. And she noticed that actually very few of the most published scholars in the field were based in film studies departments. In North America, at least, the plurality, I think, came from literature and languages departments. A lot were in areas studies and, specialized in film within that context. There were, some notable figures from anthropology and from other social sciences, and so on and so forth. In Nigeria, it's a different story. I think theater arts departments have, most of the people writing about film come from that background, and there certainly simply have not been many or for a long time any real film studies programs in Nigeria where one could get a thorough grounding in that discipline, either as an undergraduate or in the graduate level. That started to change, and yesterday on the panel for Hyginus Akwazi, we heard more about his efforts to get the NUC to split film programs off from theater arts, which really have stunted their development. And I think that's potentially very important. But anyway, Maura Dawan's point here was that actually Nollywood studies, it's a branch of of film studies, but we, as a group, were strangely isolated from, distanced from developments within real film study programs, which has its own rapidly evolving sub-discipline. They talk about turns for some reason, this turn, that turn, and so on. And, you know, this is, again, we're, you know, as a cohort, Nollywood scholars have been almost completely isolated from all of that. Noah's been the most prominent exception to this rule. He's made a series of very powerful interventions into Nollywood studies by harnessing these kind of recently developed sub-disciplines within film studies, you know, all of which are more or less recognized and established in North America and Europe, but they've been news to Nollywood studies. For instance, his 2015 book, Nollywood Stars. I imagine most of the words which have ever been published about Nollywood, like maybe 80 or 90% of them, have been about Nollywood Stars, written by journalists mostly. But, you know, that huge, massive commentary has had no connection with, again, the film studies sub-discipline of star studies. And so, you know, Noah brought that to the table. He, you know, then went on to show that sophisticated archival studies can do. The very laborious, painstaking comparison of various releases of a particular film, which are very different one from another. You know, I mean, the Nollywood archive is in such horrendously bad shape that it's very difficult to assemble even, you know, the most basic you know, works within it. But anyway, it was really an eye-opening demonstration of what was possible working from that point of view. And now with Cinematic Independence, he's working out of detailed exhibition studies and a new style of expansive and imaginative, and again, very laborious and careful materialist industrial history, which is approximately the same, or at least somehow parallel to the matrix that Alexander works out of. And again, I think he's doing extraordinary work also. Noah's new book forms a kind of tight cluster with recent or forthcoming books by two of the other leading mid-career North American Nollywood scholars. Matt Brown's 2021 Indirect Subjects, Nollywood's Local Address from Duke University Press, and Connor Ryan's Lagos Never Spoils, Nollywood and Nigerian City Life, which is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. These books are all very different one from another, but they're startlingly alike in that they all historicize the video film revolution by placing it in the wider histories of Nigerian global screen media. Of course, the whole push to start talking about screen media, African screen media rather than African film, which Moan's been a strong advocate of, along with people like Carmela Garetano and Linda Way Dovey, and the project She has been running out of SOAS on African Screen Media, which Angelique has been an important part. This perception of the need to historicize Nollywood has been kind of forced on sentient observers by the corporatization of Nollywood, the new Nollywood, the reappearance of the big screen, digitization, so on and so forth, transnational corporate interventions. The landscape has really, really changed. And so Nollywood, or what we now end up calling old Nollywood or old school Nollywood or something or another, of course, it hasn't gone away, but it now coexists with these very, very different formations, and that, cassette and then CD did artisanal distribution, production and distribution is beginning to seem like a moment in the evolution of Nigerian screen media rather than the center of this story. So all three of these books end up in the present, but they all devote most of their time to exploring in depth what came before the video films, both in cinema houses and on television. This is very hard work, since the evidence is in tatters or has just disappeared irrevocably. Noah has kind of eloquent things, but not self-pitying things to say about this. But it really is, I mean, I salute these scholars for the very hard work they've done to recover what it's possible to recover. I mean, they're just scratching the surface, and other courageous people to follow in their footsteps. During the period of preceding Nollywood, of the flourishing of Nigerian cinema projection, cinema houses in Nigeria, the days when people, navigating around Lagos was in large part a matter of following the landmarks of the cinemas. They were used that way when people gave actions on the street. So journalists and industry insiders and some academics noted what was happening at the time. But then for a long time, not much original work was done on that topic, and we kind of contented ourselves with repeating some generalizations which were approximately true, I still think, but certainly didn't do justice to the situation, because understandably our attention was kind of caught by this huge shiny new object, which was Nollywood. Anyway, all three of these authors are dedicated and very skilled researchers. They've all produced fine books, and taken together, they make me feel like we're really getting somewhere. The literature is much stronger than it was before these books were written, and I'm looking, large holes have been plugged and new fields have been opened up, and I really am looking forward to seeing the way that the field changes as a result. So I find Noah's books kind of fiery anti-imperialism invigorating. And I'll admit it provokes some nostalgia in me, because it reminds me of the leftists. I mean, I kind of grew up with the war in Vietnam in the the culture of opposition to that war. So anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and a certain strain of anti-Americanism. What my country was doing in the world was an absolutely central preoccupation, from the beginning. Coca-colonization, a word that I think no, it doesn't actually use, but it was around. I think I first encountered it in a Godard film, but it was actually invented by the French Communist Party right after World War II, and was picked up right across Europe as when Europe felt under threat from the newly hegemonic American, popular culture. Disneyfication as a word and as a concept is almost as old as that. But then the inadequacies of a simple bipolar model of cultural imperialism, began to be obvious as we went along. That was maybe a necessary part of the picture, but certainly not sufficient. And my initial attraction to Nollywood was partly because it was so far out of that model that it posed a challenge to kind of completely reinvent my whole intellectual toolkit. As I began my work, I have to give a shout out to Biodun Jaifu, who was, a great example, his book on the traveling theater, of a Marxist tradition of studying Nigerian popular culture. And of course, Karen Barber, who came out of the Birmingham School, which itself was rooted in a Marxist cultural studies. So, this kind of old school anti-imperialism did seem out of date at a certain point, but American capitalism is American capitalism. And it, once again, is a crucial part of the Nigerian screen media scene. And, we can't ignore it. Noah has shoved this stuff back under our noses, and it's convincing. Coca-Cola and Disney are still the tip of the spear, of American intervention, which is kind of amazing and distressing. The original anti-cultural imperialism style tended to paint with a broad brush, and we did need to learn to appreciate nuance in our analyses and respect the agency of the people who were at the receiving end of this stuff, and so on and so forth. Noah's absorbed this lesson, and his method is to produce a series of very fine-grained, thoroughly researched case studies. He really has chops as a worker in the archives. And out of that, he produces a series of close-ups, as it were, that are stitched into together into a continued narrative. His prose is slashing in something like the great tradition of Marxist prose. His deployment of scare quotes is second to none. Really very impressive. He references David McNally's hermeneutics of suspicion, an orientation which can tip over into paranoia, but as they say, even paranoiacs have real enemies. And there really is no underestimating the persistent, merciless pressure of late capitalism. His argument about the present makes a lot of the relationships of Filmhouse, the the multiplex chain that controls about half of the market for theatrical exhibition in Nigeria and in other places in West Africa. The relationship of Filmhouse with IMAX and with Disney, and Fox before Disney bought Fox out. These relationships, especially the one with Disney, is said to be coercive, which I believe, but we're given few details about those arrangements and even fewer numbers. I suspect this is because those contractual matters are kept secret. In my 2018 Africa Today article, Keeping Up, the corporatization of Nollywood's economy, and the subtitle goes on and on, I made the point that, those of us who were used to studying the old Nollywood of the marketers were used to having to deal with their legendary secretiveness and the character of the informal sector, where things were seldom, if ever, written down at all. That was, a whole set of skills that one had to learn to kind of work around those central facts. If you're dealing with the new corporate side of Nollywood, there's a lot of exact information being produced, even mechanically produced, by the technologies involved. But the problem is our access to it. A whole lot of what we would want to know is now shielded behind corporate secrecy. There are mountains about viewership, which I would love to see, which make all the previous work on the audience for Nollywood, which mostly involved people handing out questionnaires on paper outside of movie theaters or something. Those just look hopelessly elementary compared to the data which is now being produced. But we can't see it. It's proprietary information. Even Filmhouse employees in Lagos, whom I've spoken to, say this stuff is not shared with them by headquarters except on a need-to-know basis. So anyway,
John,
yeah,
could you round up in the next few minutes?
In the next few seconds.
Few minutes. So that Noah has enough time to respond.
I really am at the end, but I was just wanted to leave this as a question for Noah. You mentioned in the acknowledgments the people from Filmhouse and other places, Silverbird, whom you've spoken to, who all requested anonymity and so on. But I think this is another case where those of us used to working on Nollywood need to hear from people used to working on Hollywood, where getting information out of corporations who don't necessarily want to divulge it has been a problem since forever. So anyway, I'd just be curious to hear whatever you had to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the three reviewers who had approached the book and, from very different perspectives and giving us a lot to think about. So first, Noah is going to respond, and you will have your 12 to 15 minutes. You're the author. You have the right of reply. And then I hope folks who are in the room in Lagos and those who are on Zoom will have their questions and comments to share as well. And indeed, I would welcome the reviewers responding to the way in which Noah responds to their questions and coming up with, further, follow-up to those questions. That would be very helpful. So Noah, it's your.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I really appreciate your engagement with my work. This is really humbling. I mean, there's a lot to say. I would love to have a conversation back and forth with you about many of these issues. of archives that I consulted, and that's certainly a problem. I wanted to visit the National Archives in particular. I wanted to go to Ibadan, and I was unable to make that trip. So that's definitely that's a significant lacuna here. And I try to justify the one-sidedness of the archival discoveries in the acknowledgements by saying that it is perhaps more useful and more revealing of corporate malfeasance to look to the metropole and to the archives there. That's a bit of a cheat. That's a bit of an out, right? That's a way of excusing the limited travel that I conducted for this book. But you're absolutely right. A trip to Jos would certainly be illuminating. The comment you made about Echo Atlantic is also generative. I appreciate that for sure. It is entirely possible that I overstate in the book the power IMAX has to shape aspects of the development of Echo Atlantic. Nevertheless, IMAX is there already. IMAX has been there, and that embeddedness interests me. The of IMAX to insert itself into these processes of gentrification going on in the reclaimed lands is fascinating, I think. So you have Filmhouse formally partnering with IMAX, and the two corporate entities are basically saying, if you want to live the good life, the island life, then you're going to have to understand that you will have access, easy access to the best that the multiplex has to offer, Filmhouse and IMAX. And so they're really branding Echo Atlantic and themselves in relation to Echo in these ways. So thank you so much. Thank you for all of that. We could talk a little bit about Echo Atlantic as a group. It's obviously still in the process of formation, including with heavy investment capital from China, as you know. Alexander raises so many points, so many brilliant points. I feel guilty because the first draft of this book contained abundant references to your work, to your scholarship. So I quoted you a lot more in the first draft, which was way too long. So I had to cut the chapter length literature review that was again heavily dependent on your interventions, on your scholarship. And so your appearance in the final draft of this book is in a footnote. So I feel bad about that. There's just the one reference to your insight about the state having been a part of the story from the very beginning, right? You argue brilliantly that Hollywood emerged, yes, sure, partly in the absence of state regulation, but also with, to some degree, the involvement of the state. It's wrong to think of it outside of the framework of state building, of state capacity. We're tempted to, based on the legendary informality of the industry, based on the grassroots character of the industry as it developed. But I really relied on and continue to rely on that insight of yours. So I'm deeply appreciative. I'm glad you mentioned the relationship between Hollywood and the Lebanese. I tried to draw out aspects of that relationship. I mean, we all know that the Lebanese merchant class, the Levantan merchant class, has been so powerful in Nigeria for such a long time, and we know that Lebanese businessmen were involved in the running of movie theaters in Nigeria. A lot of them just owned entire movie theater chains. Entire families from Lebanon owned and operated extensive movie. But I wanted to make that relationship a little clearer by emphasizing the role of the Lebanese as intermediaries between Hollywood capital, between Hollywood studios and Nigerian consumers. And I did that partly by tracing the relationship back to Lebanon and back to Egypt, because major Hollywood studios had foreign offices in Lebanon and Egypt for a number of decades before they opened foreign offices in Lagos. And so, you know, MGM of Egypt, Paramount of Egypt, Paramount of Lebanon, other studios, but primarily MGM and Paramount were doing business on the ground in Egypt and Lebanon. And so it was there that they were first able to partner with Lebanese businessmen who facilitated their ongoing efforts to penetrate the Nigerian market, because of course the Lebanese were already in Nigeria as well. So I wanted to say a little bit about that relationship. Not nearly enough. I mean, there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done about that particular relationship. I found less information about the role of Syrian exhibitors, Syrian-owned movie theaters, and their relationship to Hollywood capital. But, you know, Alexander is absolutely right. They're not just puppets. They were never just puppets of Hollywood capital. And so, you know, Jonathan mentioned this as well. The heroic John Haynes read the original version of this book that was, you know, incredibly long. It was, you know, 3 times longer than the published version. And I think he'll agree that it was pretty shrill in its anti-imperialism, in its anti-Americanism, in its paranoia, in its to indict Hollywood capital. Some of that shrillness certainly remains, but Jonathan helped me to rein myself in. He inspired me to take a more nuanced approach to these questions. So I'm really glad that Alexander brought up that point, that, you know, it simply doesn't do to suggest that any one entity is merely a puppet of Hollywood capital, is merely doing the bidding of Hollywood capital. The chapter on Enugu, I couldn't read that. I mean, The Mark of the Hawk is a terrible film in every way. I mean, it's just form shoddy. It's ideologically repellent. It's just no good. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it, because what I believed and still believe it represented, because of what it says about the political economy of the Eastern region, right, as it was wrestling with autonomy in the late 1950s, right, as it was struggling with questions of realism and independence. You know, Enugu, as you know, was in competition with Lagos, certainly in the late 1950s. And so this idea that Enugu could compete with Lagos by inviting Hollywood filmmakers was bandied about beginning in the mid-1950s. And so by late 1950s, when this independent Hollywood company, Lloyd Young and Associates, arrive on the ground. And so, I think the story could be a whole book, especially when you consider that the film The Mark of the Hawk was actually shot on the grounds of the Eva Valley mine. It was shot on the site of the Colliery shooting of 1949. And so, again, a terrible movie, but if you watch it, you're actually able to see what these coal mines looked like in the late 1950s. And so the location footage is invaluable. And yet Iñigu's ambition for cinema didn't come to pass because Lloyd Young and Associates just sort of fled and nothing really happened. Iñigu was told that they would get expert assistance. Iñigu was told that, these American whiz kids would help them to develop a regionally autonomous film industry, a film industry that could survive on its own after their departure. And that, of course, just didn't happen. These planned film villages were just fantasies. And I thought it was interesting to engage with this story also as a precursor to what began happening in the late 1990s. And Jonathan, his book Hollywood, has written about this. His chapter on the epic film is partly about the eastward movement of Nollywood filmmaking, right? So what happens in the late 1990s is that it becomes increasingly clear that you can't set a film in the pre-colonial past if you shoot in urban high-density Lagos. You can't really fake Lagos. You have to go east. You have to go also to a place like Iñigu where there are some support systems in place for location shooting. A lot of that. Alexander asks if there's a specific connection between Tinapa and the Making of the Mark of the Hawk. No, that was just a geological connection that occurred to me. I didn't find any direct there. None of the documents on Tinapa that I've seen make any reference to the Mark of the Hawk. It's almost as if it's been forgotten. There are certainly reasons for that. It's perhaps an embarrassing story. It's certainly a failure. It represented a failed initiative, not from the perspective of Lloyd Young and Associates, but certainly from the perspective of the Eastern region. Again, the London connection, I really appreciate, Alexander, the points that you make about that. I don't deal as much as I should with the immediate pre-19 period, the early 90s in particular. That's partly because I really had to lay some tensions on the scope of the book, because originally, and John remembers this, originally I wanted to take a longue durée approach and just try to present a continuous history of foreign capitals' attempts to penetrate the Nigerian market for motion pictures. And that just didn't work for a number of reasons that Jonathan identified a few years ago when he read that first draft. And so I thought about 1999, partly for its symbolic value, but also because I do think that the return of democracy was sold on the international stage to corporations, particularly in Hollywood, as a really exciting development. It was strategically presented as a way of drumming up excitement. So a lot of state and parastatal organizations were saying after 1999, come back to Nigeria. because things are happening now. Exciting things are happening now. I love that you mentioned, Alexander, the screenings below the Odeon and the Empire at the grassroots level in London, because that's a really important point. I'm often asked how many movie theaters there are in Nigeria, and I don't have a number. And I don't want to answer that question because it depends on how you're defining movie theater. It depends on what your conception of theatrical exhibition is. It depends on how you're defining it in relation to commerce. Are you including non-commercial locations? Are you including what in film studies are known as non-theatrical locations? I try to cast a wide net in this book. I don't do that for London. There's a lot of work that should be done, as Alexander points out, about those smaller scale screenings of Nigerian films in less capitalized movie theaters. I try to make a point in the book and in talking about the book to mention that there are movie theaters, many movie theaters in Nigeria that operate from the giants like Filmhouse and Silverbird that are distinct from them. So it doesn't do to reduce commercial theatrical exhibition to the multiplex chains. So the landscape is dotted by more than just Filmhouse and Silverbird and Genesis Deluxe. There are far less capitalized operations. In the book, I mentioned Lighthouse Cinemas in Delta State. That is a small scale operation, a kind of mom and pop operation that doesn't even have all that many seats, and yet it's still able to book films. There are other venues like Happy Land, Happy World on the mainland. I mentioned Happy Land, Happy World in the conclusion. And these are smaller theaters that are run without any corporate involvement, certainly without the direct participation of IMAX. They're, not even necessarily compliant with digital cinema initiatives. And so they're part of the story too. And so I'm really glad that Alexander mentioned the London specific counterparts of those. And John, Haynes does a great job of explaining the disciplinary backgrounds of those of us who work on Hollywood. And this is a question I struggle with. Trained, conduct extensive ethnographic research, and I still feel uncomfortable doing so for a number of reasons. When I was in graduate school in cinema studies, my advisor kept telling me not to interview people. He said, people lie, people self-aggrandize, they self-mythologize, they're not going to tell you the truth of entry. They're not reliable. And I was really young, and that advice stayed with me until this book, until this project, when I decided that I wanted to talk to employees of Filmhouse and Silverbird. And I was able to do so because I have some contacts, or I had some contacts still in the industry. I've lost a lot of people over the last few years, the crazy last few years. But I was able to get in contact with individuals who work at various levels at Filmhouse, and those conversations are really illuminating. A number of reasons, including because a lot of the individuals requested anonymity. They said, look, this is a really precarious industry. We're the movie theaters themselves are still struggling to stay alive. And so many employees were laid off with the turn to around 2012. So, before that, trained projectionists were employed, had to be employed, but with the turn to digital cinema packages, they were no longer necessary. And so Filmhouse, Silver, Genesis Deluxe, just let them go. And so those who still work there are understandably worried about losing their jobs. And they're also, in my experience, eager to talk about Disney imperialism. They're eager to talk about what they know of the relationship between Filmhouse and Disney. Now, Filmhouse is an official partner of Disney and Warner Brothers. It is the only regional West African distributor of Warner Brothers and Disney properties. So it has that intimate connection. But, as I mentioned in the book, there are a number of independent Nigerian filmmakers who are not happy about this arrangement. Filmhouse is I think, doing a little better these days, offering about 60% local films to 40% imported films. It used to be, 50-50. And even before that, the balance favored Hollywood to a degree. Now that's changing, but it's still a question. I mean, would you rather Black Panther 2 from Disney or a locally produced film in a popular genre? John mentions Matt Brown's work. His dissertation title, The Long Nollywood Century, was and remains an inspiration. I love that title. I think it's such a brilliant and provocative, because deliberately a historical provocation.
No, I'm going to give you 2 minutes more.
Sure,
because I want people in the room to be able to ask questions.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a lot to talk about. The Long Nollywood Century inspired me. I am definitely worried about the inadequacies of the bipolar model of imperialism that John mentioned. Generation to discipline, discipline, but also, I wasn't around in Nigeria in the early 1990s. I wasn't on the ground. And so in thinking about doing this book, I asked myself what I possibly have that I can contribute, right? I wasn't there. I don't have this intimate knowledge of how the industry developed. I don't have what John has. I don't have what Moradewin has. I don't have the linguistic skills. I don't have the theoretical sophistication of a Moradewin at a Jumobi. What do I have? I have a background in film studies, and I have a certain degree of knowledge about Hollywood and how Hollywood has operated historically. And so I just wanted to bring those two, and bring Hollywood and Nollywood together to try to make a modest contribution. So thank you to all of you. Again, lots to talk about. I'm really humbled. I'm really grateful for your engagement with my work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noah. I think your book is more than a modest contribution to the field and to the discipline. And I think we're all very grateful to have someone who is from film studies weighing in on the development of screen media in Nigeria, because as John says, a lot of the folks, at least initially, have been from the background of literary studies, textual studies, rather than media and film studies. And in the case of Nigeria, because we've seen some people with a communications background rather than, but coming to media and film from a different perspective. I wonder if there are people who are in the room in Lagos who have questions for Noah. And if I understand rightly, Noah, the book is available open source. It is available open source. So if you have a good online connection and you have data, you can actually download the entire book. It's a free download. Noah is confirming. So please, if you're in the room and you haven't yet read this book, please go online and look for it and download it. But other people in the room who have who are there right there in Lagos to start with, who have questions for Noah, before I come back to the members of the panel, the reviewers, if they would like to expand further on their comments. Anybody in the room, the people who are there in the room can tell me if anyone who has questions that they would like to ask. Do we see anybody? Not yet. We're trusting Alexander, so not yet. While people in the room are thinking of their questions, I will also like to I'll say one or two things and then invite the reviewers, Chijoke, as well with Sife, Alexander Bud, and John, if they want to say anything further, because you know all of you had a very limited time to kind of like respond to this book. I'll say one or two things, not so much to ask to pose a kind of question which is not necessarily for Noah, but which is for all of us who work on Nollywood. And I go back to something that Alexander said about epochs, and I think we want to go back and rethink what are the epochs of screen media in Nigeria. You know, and where do we place Nollywood in relation to all of those different epochs? Because so much has been happening. I think especially helpful in showing the degree to which corporations we're now worried about were involved in Nigeria going back to the 1950s. You know, we've been reading a lot about the corporatization, which is happening now. Apparently, it has a much longer, and we're very thankful to Noah Tsika's book for kind of like informing us about this history, which goes back further in time than we might think. One of the things that I found, I say unnerving, kind of interesting for me. I didn't know about the close connection between Film One and Disney. So that came as a kind of surprise to me. And it came especially as a surprise to me because during the COVID period, and I've mentioned this to one or two people, unfortunately, we haven't been able to all see each other at conferences in person for some time, but I've mentioned it to one or two people that, as you know, I'm in California, and Disney approached me in California because they were planning, and maybe are still planning, to make a film based on Yoruba mythology. They wanted a native speaker to weigh in and to guide us. Eventually, we have, because the terms, to take the document, the contract that they present, take it to an attorney, because there was just so much there that seemed like, whoa. They were basically almost asking me to sign off on selling Yoruba mythology to Disney so that Disney would hex or control all rights to ever show anything relating to Yoruba mythology on screen. And so, I saw the part. It's like, wait, it's interesting to know that they have their hand in distribution in Nigeria and to some extent production, but they're also trying to plug a gap from the Hollywood side of also appropriating certain things and taking them over and pushing them forward. So when I read, Noah's book, I was kind of like, wait, these people are, it's like double dipping. They're dipping in on distribution in Nigeria and on the African continent and West Africa, and they're also dipping in on production and intellectual property that comes out of Nigerian culture and history on the Hollywood side. So that was to me kind of like really intriguing and surprising that they would be working from these two angles at once. We have roughly 10 minutes more. I don't know whether our reviewers, Chijoke, Alex, or John, have additional comments they would like to make to Noah, or whether Noah would like to follow up on some of the things he has said earlier.
just really, in the first place, Moradewa, you shouldn't credit me for talking about the zoology backgrounds of people doing this work. I was quoting you. And just the other thing, Noah's comments about wondering, what he might be capable of doing within this field where there's so much that, he didn't know. I mean, I felt that way all the time since the beginning. My training was in English Renaissance literature, which wasn't directly, kind of qualifying me to go try to talk to Itamoto marketers. I mean, anyway, Nollywood. So I've had the strong perception from the beginning that, object of Nollywood as an object of knowledge is just way too big for any one person to take on alone. So, we've all got our little piece that maybe we can contribute, but we need each other. It's definitely a collective struggle.
Thank you for that. In the comment that monopoly never dies, just like Lagos never dies, but monopoly capital is always alive in every space and in every way, and it's innovative. Monopoly capital is always up with new exploiting various markets around the world, even in places you would think that Disney would be too scared of Nigeria. Apparently not. Deep in there, and trying to make money and trying to shape the development of the screen media enterprise in Nigeria, because when you think of the extent at a certain point in time, and maybe still does, was shaping what could be seen, but then it's also shaping what was being made. So another kind of double dipping. At this point in time, it's national capital, local capital, rather than the global capital, but both being very active. Anybody in the room in Lagos with questions? Chijioke and Alexander, do you have some additional thoughts before we hand the microphone back to Noah?
Fine from over here, thank you.
Oh, yeah, fine, okay.
So
I think someone might have a question in the room. Yes, please, could you come closer so that we can hear your question?
Okay. Hi, everybody. So
hello.
This is not
Hi,
a very
Carmen.
This is not a very well-formed comment, because I'm just thinking about another panel that just happened that I was hoping someone in the room who paid better attention was there, but it was an animation panel put together by Michael Shidoro, and okay, you were in it. And I think there were some pretty direct connections to Disney there as well. So that's just a comment.
Yeah. Thank you very much for bringing that up, Carmen. The panel on animation, very, very interesting. I attended that one, and there was a question about who the animators were making their productions for. Was it for people in Nigeria? Was it for people outside? And there's a very lively debate about that, because if I understood rightly, several of the animators were saying currently it's difficult for people in Nigeria to purchase, to expend, finances, limited finances on the kind of things that they're making. So they are thinking more of an international market, but thinking of an international diaspora market, and hoping, and telling their stories that way. But as Carmen pointed out, a number of the people who were in the animators panel do have ongoing conversations with Disney. So the next book for someone who's in the audience, either online or in the room, Disney in Nigeria, the past and the present and the future. So that's a book that's waiting to be written. Disney in Nigeria, what's happening now on different fronts, so clearly animation, film production, green lighting projects in the US, but also distribution in Nigeria and production in Nigeria. So an amazing story that is waiting to be told. Do you have anything to say, Alexander, before I hand it over back to Noah for some closing words?
Yeah, just one quick point to ask Noah about, just a little bit more on this topic of integration. I think that was a really great way to end the book. I've read quite a bit about integration in film industries from a different perspective of innovation studies, which is a much less politically conscious perspective, and much more to do with kind of business efficiency. And there's been particularly interesting work done on Bollywood. And anyway, the argument put forward by certain scholars like Mark Lawrenson is that there's a tendency for there to be higher levels of concentration as an integration in the marketing end of film production, of the film industry, than on the production end. And it's couched very much in terms of that, of it being a kind of natural monopoly or natural oligopoly on the marketing end. Now, I don't think that particularly contradicts Noah's point about vertical integration, but it does add a little bit more subtlety in that whilst there is integration, there may be a different level of integration on the marketing distribution end than on the production end, both in terms of what's actually happening in the ground and what kind of forces may be influencing this shape of the industry. So these arguments are very much within the world of the neoliberal approach that he's arguing against, but still they are quite fine-grained arguments coming from an interesting discipline. So I'd just be interested to hear his thoughts.
Thank you, Noah. You have exactly 2 minutes to respond, because they're
2 minutes.
reminding us that our time is almost up.
I will say that in the 1970s, Disney was actually actively involved in trying to establish Disneyland Nigeria. And it was doing so with the assistance of Henry Kissinger. All of this information is in the US State Department archives so you can actually read these correspondences, read these documents that outline Disney's ambitions for Nigeria. I mean, Disney was thinking in terms of theme parks. And I mentioned in the book that these provisional theme parks were constructed by the Cinerama Corporation throughout mainland Lagos in the 1960s to promote Cinerama, because there were no Cinerama screens. There were no proper facilities for Cinerama exhibition in Nigeria, but the company identified a Nigerian appetite for Cinerama, right? We're always talking about these corporate ambitions and how they posit the promise of Nigeria, the promise of Nigerians. They're seeing, dollar signs and the sheer population density of this country. Concentrations of power, so much to say about that. I wanted to try to figure out how we got here, how we got to the dominance of Filmhouse. And my question is whether Filmhouse is replicating in its own way, on its own scale, the vertical integration of Hollywood. They're just reproducing that. But yeah, a lot to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Noah for the book. Thank you to our reviewers. We didn't have all the reviewers present, but we definitely occupied all the time. So thank you to all of you. And thank you to the people in the room as well. Just a reminder, you can get Noah's book online, and hope to welcome, additional conversations about screen media in Nigeria, about Nollywood at next year's LSA. Thank you and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.